Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Quite a few men watch these videos, you know. They tune in just like you ladies to learn all sorts of things. And since so much of what I teach about menopause pertains just as much to men as it does to women, they get the education here that they deserve and don't get elsewhere. So welcome to Menopause University, where I address everything you need to know in order to make the rest of your life the best of your life. And one of the things you need to know most is how to avoid Alzheimer's, because the rest of your life will not be the best of your life if you get Alzheimer's. So this is part of a big unit on Alzheimer's, and it's video number 245. This one is going to be on the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and it will tell you how to know if you're at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, in my book, this material is in chapter 33, all of which is on Alzheimer's, and it's in the section entitled Risk Factors. But as usual, I will elaborate more here than I do in the book. In fact, today I will present the entire list of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, but then I will expound on several of the risk factors in the next few videos. This one video will set the stage for all the subsequent videos in this Alzheimer's unit. And that includes the additional videos on risk factors, as well as all the videos that I'll be giving you on management options for preventing Alzheimer's. So you definitely need to watch this particular video. Now, if you've been a student of Menopause University for any length of time, you know that all diseases have what we call risk factors. Risk factors are all the things that contribute to your likelihood of getting a disease. The more risk factors you have, the greater the likelihood that you will end up with that disease. The fewer the risk factors you have, the lower the likelihood that you'll end up with that disease. So far in this education on menopause, I've covered the units on heart attack and osteoporosis. And you learned that both of those diseases have very long lists of risk factors. And again, if you've been a student of Menopause University for a while, you know that I make a lot of charts to summarize the lessons for you. And I've made charts on the risk factors for both heart attack and osteoporosis. You might recall seeing this one for heart attack. And you might recall seeing this one for osteoporosis. So, it is quite common for any disease to have multiple risk factors. In other words, there are many different things that can contribute to your likelihood of getting a disease. And the same is true for Alzheimer's. Another observation about risk factors is that some are modifiable, while others are not. The key is to focus on those that you can modify and learn all the different ways to modify them. That's what I teach you. And it's important to know your risks for different diseases so that you can manage your menopause accordingly. For instance, everybody's so worried about breast cancer. But to put things into perspective just a bit, in your 60s, your risk for Alzheimer's is twice as high as your risk for breast cancer. So pay attention to this video today. I'll present the risk factors one by one, elaborating as needed to ensure your understanding. And since I love charts so much, we'll create a chart as we go along to summarize the information. And since I'm so fond of quiz questions, almost as fond of quiz questions as I am of charts, I'll start off with one of those just to get you thinking. So here's the quiz question. Which of the following is the strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease? A, genetics. B, female gender. C, educational level. D, age. E, history of traumatic head injury. F, family history. G, depression. H, alcoholism. I, smoking. J, chronic stress, or K, social isolation? What a wide variety of options. Which one seems most significant to you? And if you know which one is the strongest, why is it the strongest? Well, here's the quiz question again with the correct answer in bold font. All right, so now you know that age is the strongest risk factor of all. So let's start with that. Anytime age is a risk factor for a disease, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you can be relatively sure that you won't get that disease when you're young. But it's a curse because you cannot prevent aging. And any disease that is associated with aging will increase in incidence as humans continue to live longer and longer. The man who first described Alzheimer's disease was Alois Alzheimer, and the year was 1907. Since that time, the incidence of Alzheimer's has not changed. You learned in the last video that incidence refers to the number of new cases over a given period of time. So the number of new cases for different age groups has not changed. But the numbers of people living long enough to develop Alzheimer's has. And that is why age is the strongest risk factor of all. Starting at age 65, the proportion of individuals with Alzheimer's doubles with each additional 10 years of age. At age 65, only about 5% of people have Alzheimer's, but by age 85, 50% have it. Now, of course, you can't modify your age. So, let's set that on a chart and let's distinguish modifiable from non-modifiable risk factors. The chart is simple. In the first column, you see the designations non-modifiable and modifiable as the two categories of risk factors. Surprise! There are more modifiable risk factors than there are non-modifiable ones. As we fill in the chart, you'll discover what they are. In the second column, you see the beginning of our list of risk factors. The third column is for designating any parameters that apply, and the fourth column is for any other specifics. For age, you see that the risk doubles every 10 years. Now, since age is the most important risk factor, the very next video will be on your aging brain, and in it, I will contrast a brain that ages normally with one that ages abnormally. The second risk factor is genetics. Now, genetics isn't simple, so I will mention it today, but I will give you an entire tutorial on it, on nothing but genetics of Alzheimer's in 3 weeks. And that's because there are different kinds of genetic mutations that can put you at risk for Alzheimer's. They can increase your risk of Alzheimer's to different degrees depending on the type of mutation. But the timing, degree, and severity can vary greatly. From a simplistic standpoint, if you have a genetic predisposition for Alzheimer's, you have a higher risk of getting it. But it is not absolute. Your genetics are but a template. Whether or not they express themselves can depend on a variety of other things. We call this genetic expression. So I will list genetics in the non-modifiable portion of the chart because you cannot modify your actual genetics, but you can modify the likelihood of actually getting Alzheimer's regardless of your genetics. So here it is on our chart. You can see that in the parameter column, I've listed a bunch of acronyms that designate the specific genetic mutations. I'll teach you all about those in video 248, 3 weeks from now. And you also see the specifics of early versus late Alzheimer's in the last column. That's something else we'll discuss in 3 weeks. Okay, closely related to genetics is your family history. Now, family Family history is always a bit of a sticky issue. Unfortunately, most people take it to mean much more than it means. Just because you're related to someone who has had Alzheimer's does not mean you will have it. There are just so many things that people ignore when they focus on family history. First of all, every disease has a long list of risk factors. And every person who gets any disease has control over most of those risk factors. So you have to take into account how a family member may have contributed to their risk of the disease. And we all tend to ignore disease accountability. We don't like to admit that we cause a lot of our own diseases ourselves. But family history totally ignores this. In the unit on heart attack, I gave you an entire video on the fact that your family history of heart attack has much more to do with the behaviors you share with your family members than anything else. And that's true for most diseases. So when it comes to your family history, look beyond the fact that someone is family and focus more on how they live. Now, with regard to Alzheimer's, the only relatives who are pertinent to your risk of Alzheimer's disease are your first-degree relatives. Your first-degree relatives are those with whom you have a direct relationship and no one between you. You've seen this before. It's a family tree. Here's you, right there in the middle, at the bottom, waiting. The only relatives on this board who are first-degree relatives are your mother and father here, your siblings, and your children. That's it. Your aunts and uncles, grandparents, and cousins do not contribute to your risk of Alzheimer's. So, sorry folks, we're getting rid of all of you. They are insignificant. No disrespect intended. But all these folks have nothing at all to do with your risk of Alzheimer's. None of these people matter. See? It's shocking when you take away everybody who doesn't matter, isn't it? It really becomes kind of fearful. Okay. You're left with just that. Now, the likelihood of your children contributing to your risk of Alzheimer's is very low. Okay? But you're left with nothing but first-degree relatives. Okay. So, but if any of the first-degree relatives has had Alzheimer's, it does increase your own risk by about 30% over whatever your existing risk is based on your own risk factors. So let's put family history on our chart. All right, moving on to the fourth risk factor for Alzheimer's, which is previous traumatic head injury. Any type of traumatic head injury causes damage to brain cells. Damaged brain cells most commonly die. So the result is very similar to what I taught you in video 242 on the pathology of Alzheimer's. When brain cells die, your brain shrinks. And that's what you see with both traumatic head injury and Alzheimer's. Now, you can have just one episode of traumatic head injury, or you can have multiple episodes. The more episodes you have, the higher your risk for Alzheimer's. And if the trauma is chronic, it's higher still. There's a great movie called Concussion on this very topic. It's about the discovery of plaques and tangles in football players who have sustained repeated head injuries. In the movie, the pathological findings are called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, and it's all about a physician who's played by Will Smith, who discovers these pathological features in the brains of deceased football players. Well, you don't have to be a football player, and the trauma does not have to be chronic or repetitive. If you have ever had any kind of traumatic head injury, it can increase your risk of Alzheimer's. So here it is on our chart. Okay, there's only one more non-modifiable risk factor. Care to guess what it is? Oh, come on, it's easy. It's gender. Specifically, it's female gender. This is actually the second most important risk factor after age, but I changed the order because of the risk factors that follow this one and the order in which I'm going to address it in later videos. Being female all by itself increases your risk of Alzheimer's. Now, why is that? Well, the most common explanation is that women live longer than men. That explanation doesn't really make much sense, given the fact that the risk is higher for women at all ages, but that is the explanation you'll most often get. While more women reach the ages at which Alzheimer's is most common, the ratio of female to male Alzheimer's is 2 to 1 at all ages. As a woman, you are twice as likely to get Alzheimer's as a man. So here it is on our chart. So, the 5 non-modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's are age, genetics, family history, previous traumatic head injury, and female gender. So now we turn our attention to the risk factors that are modifiable. The first one is very closely related to the one we just discussed. It's estrogen deficiency. Now this is very, very important. Why? Well, think about it. The 2 strongest risk factors for Alzheimer's are age and being female. And what happens to you as you age if you are female? You lose your estrogen. So estrogen deficiency is a very profound factor. And although I'm listing it as the first modifiable risk factor, it is a result of something that is inevitable, postmenopause. And that's why it's so important to dwell on it in any education on menopause. So I'll be giving you a few videos dedicated to the effect of estrogen loss on your brain. And what you'll see is that this relationship between estrogen deficiency and Alzheimer's is linear. That means all of the following. The earlier you become estrogen deficient, the higher your risk. The more abruptly you become estrogen deficient, the higher your risk. And the longer you stay estrogen deficient, the higher your risk. And just as you learned with regard to heart attack and osteoporosis, you will discover that there is a critical window of opportunity for starting estrogen replacement in order to prevent Alzheimer's. Timing, everything depends on timing. So for now, we will simply place estrogen deficiency on our chart as the first modifiable risk factor. The next risk factor for Alzheimer's is a biggie. It's low educational level. The cold, hard fact is that Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain that results from failure to use your brain. Now, the good news is that this is not restricted to what you've already learned thus far in your lifetime. Even if you didn't attend high school, you can still lower your risk for Alzheimer's with regard to your educational level. And there are many facets of this one risk factor that we will address in future videos. It is one of the risk factors that warrants some videos dedicated solely to it. But for now, we're going to just list it simply as low educational level on our chart. And next we have another really big risk factor. This one might surprise you. In a nutshell, it's everything that puts you at risk for a heart attack. Can you believe it? If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. It's all about blood flow. Anything that prevents blood flow to your heart causes part of your heart to die. That's a heart attack. Likewise, anything that prevents blood flow to your brain causes parts of your brain to die. In the long term, that's Alzheimer's. So here's the big list of risk factors for a heart attack that I showed you at the beginning of this video. They include previous heart attack, smoking, high LDL cholesterol, low HDL cholesterol, total cholesterol to HDL ratio of greater than 4, high triglycerides, obesity, abdominal fat, high blood pressure, diabetes, sedentary lifestyle, gum disease, high homocysteine, depression, and family history of heart attack. The only heart attack risk factor that does not contribute to a higher risk of Alzheimer's on that list is gum disease. I'm going to incorporate all the others into our chart on the risk factors for Alzheimer's. It's going to be a bit tricky in terms of making them all fit, isn't it? Now, if you haven't watched the videos in the unit on heart attack, you'll just have to go back and watch them in order to understand the significance of this big chunk of risk factors. There is just no way I can explain them all again here. This is why I tell you over and over and over to watch my videos in order. There's just no other way that you'll get the education you deserve. Now, you may view the fact that the risk factors for heart attack and Alzheimer's overlap as either a good thing or a bad thing. It's a good thing in that you can reduce your risk for both diseases by doing what it takes to reduce your risk for just the other one. But it's a bad thing if you're unwilling to do what it takes to reduce those risk factors. But one of the recurring themes you will see in this education is overlap of risk factors and management options. And you'll see that there are some things that can benefit you in a multitude of ways. So what's left? Well, there are still 5 more risk factors for Alzheimer's. The next one is alcohol abuse. If you've been in the habit of drinking a lot of alcohol on a regular basis, you are at higher risk of Alzheimer's. Unlike the case with heart attack and osteoporosis, in which there are actual known quantities of alcohol that are either beneficial or detrimental, the quantities pertinent to Alzheimer's are less well defined. But let's be realistic. Is any alcohol good for your brain? Can you think of any way that alcohol can have any beneficial effect on your brain in either the short term or the long term? Sometimes it shocks me that people do not see the obvious. All you have to do to realize what alcohol does to your brain is observe the behavior of people who have had too much to drink. Do their brains appear to be working better or worse than without alcohol? Well, if your brain works just a little worse every time you imbibe alcohol, what do you think the overall effect will be by the time you're at an age ripe and ready for Alzheimer's? So tell yourself whatever you want to minimize your guilt about damaging your own brain with alcohol, but you're really just playing with fire. Here's alcohol on our chart. The next risk factor for Alzheimer's is persistent or chronic stress. Now this is because stress changes the neurotransmitters that are released in your brain, and some of them damage your brain. The more intense the stress, the greater your risk. The longer lasting the stress, the greater your risk. And notice that one of the risk factors for heart attack and Alzheimer's is depression. Well, chronic stress and depression very often go hand in hand. So let's add it to our chart. Now here's one that might surprise you. It's sleep disordered breathing. This can mean a couple of things. It can be a fancy way of saying snoring, or it can simply imply sleep apnea. Regardless of the cause of disordered breathing during sleep, the outcome is the same. Your brain does not get the oxygen it needs. So this goes back to being like some of those risk factors for a heart attack. Anything that disrupts blood flow and delivery of oxygen to your brain can increase your risk of Alzheimer's. So take snoring and sleep apnea seriously. Here's our chart again. And the next risk factor has to do with sleep also. Or more appropriately, it has to do with sleep deprivation. It is so obvious that sleep is critical to normal brain function. We've all experienced the effect of a sleepless night on our ability to think clearly and efficiently the following day, right? This is especially true with menopause. Insomnia and brain fog are two of the most common symptoms of menopause. So sleep and cognition are intimately connected, and anything that disrupts your sleep also disrupts how your brain functions. Here it is on our chart. And finally, we get to the last risk factor. It's another one that might not be obvious to you. It's social isolation. Humans are very social creatures, and it turns out that social interaction with other humans has a very significant impact on the health of your brain. And in the videos on management options, you'll see that you can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's somewhat with social interaction. So let's complete our chart. That's a pretty big chart. What this means is that there are loads of things you can do to decrease your risk of Alzheimer's. Whenever there are lots of risk factors for a disease, there are lots of options for managing that disease. Now, although this looks like a huge list, you could boil it down to just a few risk factors to simplify it. And if you did that, you'd end up with age, estrogen deficiency, genetics, head trauma, education, all the risk factors for a heart attack, alcohol abuse, stress, anything that disrupts your sleep, and social isolation. You can find the chart in the link right under the screen you're watching, or you can go to my website, which is menopausetailor.me. If you go to my website, click on the YouTube video tutorials tab, and that'll take you to all the videos, in order of course, and also to all the charts I've made for you. If you have the worksheet, you will not find as extensive a list of the risk factors as I've given you here today. The great thing about these videos is that I can elaborate so much more in them than I can in any other educational venue. In any case, you now know all the risk factors for Alzheimer's, and this has set the stage for a variety of videos on individual risk factors. It will be more crucial than ever for you to watch them in order. So next week, I'll go into a discussion of how your brain ages. It will include normal brain aging as well as abnormal brain aging. So don't miss it. In the meantime, schedule a consultation at menopausetailor.me. Consultations are so beneficial. You get more than you could ever imagine, and that's why there's such a long waiting list to get one. So don't wait until you're desperate or in a hurry. You will not be able to get on my consultation calendar on short notice. You have to plan ahead. It can take weeks or months. But I promise you, it is worth the wait. Okay, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Be absolutely sure to subscribe and come back in a week. Bye.